there was a very fraught incident one day when I, naively said something, and of course my mother was very embarrassed. I'm not going to go into it because it's just too painful, but it was a memory that I have of becoming aware of race and becoming aware of the inequalities that are engendered by racism.
Oh, well said. Thank you. Thank you. Next. So how did you get from there to now here, and how did that shape your perspective? What do you learn from it?
Well, I would have to go into from there into the 60s and junior high school and high school. I still have a lot of anger about some of the things that I saw in junior high school. There was a lot of racist tracking. I hated my junior high school principal. And by that time, we had moved to Far Rockaway, Queens, New York. And there's a whole backstory to that about what is euphemistically called changing neighborhoods and gentrification and redlining, because all of that was going on, and all of that was the backdrop to our moving from Brooklyn to Far Rockaway, Queens, New York. In some left circles, I know that there's a kind of convoluted and complicated discussion that goes on about whether white Jews really are white. My position is that we're white, we're definitely white in relation to Black people and other people of color, but conditionally white in relation to white Christians. And there's a book, I don't remember the name of the anthropologist, but yes, I do, Karen Brodkin, that I would highly recommend, called How the Jews Became White Folks, because part of how I got from there to here as an anti-racist Jewish feminist is realizing that my family story is connecting to that we are Jews who, historically speaking, became white folks.
That makes sense. Excellent. And now we're up to 2 book recommendations. The Soul of Women by Isabel Allende and How Jews Became White by Karen Brodkin.
How Jews Became White Folks.
How Jews
Became Brodkin. I'll spell her last name, Brodkin.
Thank you. All the book recommendations are definitely one of the things I really enjoy about talking with you. Love it.
Right. Well, I will integrate more of those into the conversation, but I think another component of how I got from there to here that's very important is that I graduated from Far Rockaway High School in 1969, and I'm very aware of the fact that June 1969, the month and year of my graduation, is when the Stonewall uprising happened. And so that's another component of how I got from there to here, becoming conscious about the specific oppression of LGBTQ people. And something that is sort of still wrenching to me in terms of why and how we ended up, my husband and I, how we ended up moving from Brooklyn, New York to Poughkeepsie, New York, is that I have a connection to what can broadly be called radical New York, and a kind of pride in that. A few years ago, I think this was after that, really, there was a horrible, tragic attack on a gay nightclub in Florida one that had a large clientele of Latinx people. And I remember I marched as a straight ally with the Planned Parenthood contingent at the Pride March that took place around that time in New York City. And when we passed the Stonewall Inn, which is where that uprising took place, that was such an emotional moment for me that I started to cry.
Yeah, it must mean a lot. That's like more than half a century now of history and people standing up for their rights.
Right. You know, and all of these things are so interconnected. It's hard for me not to understand. It's hard for me that a lot of people on the right demonize the concept of intersectionality and don't understand it, because beyond the fine points of Kimberly Crenshaw's analysis of it in her legal articles, it just makes sense that all of these things are interrelated. You know, it certainly takes a specific form in the lives of Black women. And I should say that a precursor, a very important intellectual and political precursor to Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, is Barbara Smith, another key Black feminist who became active during the second wave of feminism, writing about the simultaneity of oppressions, that more than one form of oppression can manifest in your life simultaneously, so that it includes elements of both. And I would urge all the listeners here, if they haven't read the Combahee River Collective statement, to look it up. There are books about it, because I just think that's an essential understanding for people to have as anti-racist and as feminists. If you Google Barbara Smith, you will find books that she wrote or edited.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. That's definitely, like, all this stuff really connects both in terms of, like, if there's an injustice, it's gonna go, like, it's not gonna be like, oh, let me separate this out and we'll do the sexism on Tuesdays and the ableism on Wednesdays and the racism on Thursdays. So that's not how oppression works. And also, when people are fixing it and standing up for their rights, you can't separate it out either, because then you're gonna be
that's not how oppression works. That's not how anyone's daily life works.
Yes.
And it's also not how privilege works in people's lives. We can be privileged in a few different ways at once, and also be oppressed or potentially oppressed in several ways at once.
That's really interesting, because a lot of times you hear, oh, this is too simplistic, because it makes it seem like there's just this binary and all these oppressors over here and all these oppressed people over there, but it's not really. It's more like, okay, so you have to realize, you have to notice when there's injustice that's going on against you, so you can do something about it. You also have to notice when you might have power over somebody else, who might be told you're better than somebody else, so you can use the power responsibly or give it up and not believe that you're better, even if someone's trying to tell you.
I think this is a stumbling block for some Jews who are white, because even if we don't have a direct relationship to people who are direct survivors of the Holocaust, there's a sense in which all Jews who are alive today in this post-Holocaust era are survivors, because after all, the intention of Hitler and the Nazis was to exterminate all of us. And that's a very intense connection with a history of oppression and everything that went on before that, the pogroms, the expulsions. For those of us who are also Ashkenazi Jews, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. And of course, the historical narrative of Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews and Ethiopian Jews isn't precisely equivalent, but that doesn't mean that outside and inside of Israel, they didn't face and do not continue to face specific forms of oppression of their own.
Yeah, remember a while ago we were having a class and we had some free time. So we started talking about family histories. It was an all Jewish girls school. And we had this great science teacher who's Armenian. So when we started talking about family histories, I was looking around and was like, so a lot of our families survived genocide, and even the families that didn't have that got forced out of one country or another because they were being treated so badly there. So it's like, right. It's really like pretty much most of the Jews and a lot of the non-Jews I know have that kind of history, and kind of keeps showing up, and that runs always worried about stuff that's going on now and whether we're actually going to manage to stop having that kind of thing.
Right. Because the other side of that, as Professor Mark Dollinger points out, and this is a time for me to mention another book that I haven't gotten a chance to read yet, but that I think is very important, is a book called Black Power Jewish Politics, about how in the Black community there was a kind of transformation that went on between paradigms or models that came from the civil rights movement and then morphed into the Black Power movement and now into Black Lives Matter, and how Jewish activists related to all of that. And of course, now increasingly we're seeing that it wasn't only white Jews in the civil rights movement, but that there are Black Jews who contributed to that as well. And I don't know if you're aware that when Professor Dollinger wrote a new preface or introduction to the book, a whole controversy broke out with I think it was Brandeis University Press. Yes, I'm looking at the spine of the book now, and it was Brandeis University Press, because he talked about how, while it is true that there was a cohort of white Jews who were very engaged with and very supportive of the civil rights movement, that there are also Jews who are reactionary and who are overtly racist. You know, we saw this in the Jews who supported Donald Trump and who uphold white supremacy. And a whole debate emerged around his saying that. And I think the thing that's complicated is that people, and this, I think, applies to the liminal status of Jews, that people can be targeted by a form of oppression, and yet some of the people in that group can also have a very bad form of consciousness around it and uphold that form of oppression. We see that in Stephen Miller, who was one of Donald Trump's architects of a horrible policy towards asylum seekers that culminated in the caging of children. It was just so unspeakably cruel. You know, and thankfully, I want to add that thankfully, this gets into one of your later questions in terms of what do I want people to know about Jews. I want people to know that the vast majority of Jews were and are horrified